Hey, this is Danny here from Podcast Stories. Thanks so much for listening, and I'd love for you to get the latest episodes when they're released. So make sure to follow on your favourite podcast app or hop on over to podcasterstories.com/listen. If you enjoy the show and want to support it, you can do that at podcasterstories.com/support to join other supporters just like you. Thanks so much for being part of the Podcaster Stories community. And now, here's this week's episode.
And so when I came back to the United States, I was teaching. I told the students this story, and I said, you know, when you go to the grocery store, simple things like putting the cart in its spot makes a difference for people who work at the store. Don't put that cart in the middle of the parking lot. I mean, that's just such a little simple thing for little children to know, but tell your parents, work with your parents, because this woman has lived through hell.
Hi, and welcome to Podcaster Stories. Each episode will have a conversation with podcasters from across the globe and share their story, what motivates them, why they started a show, how they grew the show, and more. We'll also talk about their personal lives and some of the things that have happened that have made them the person they are today. And now here's your host, Danny Brown. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Podcaster Stories, where we get to meet the people behind the voices of the shows we listen to. This week, I have Catherine Praiswater, who's the host of Your Positive Imprint, a show highlighting people around the world whose positive achievements are inspiring positive actions. Catherine, welcome to the show. How about you tell us about yourself and your podcast?
Well, hello, Danny. Thank you so much for having me on. This is exciting. Usually I'm on the other end, right? So I'm Catherine, yes, and I live in New Mexico, and we travel, before COVID, we travel quite a bit, and we're hikers and bikers, and we love Hawaii, hence my little Hawaiian
nice.
Jewelry that I have on. But I do have a podcast, Your Positive Imprint, and there's so many different reasons as to why I wanted to do this type of podcast. And I'm going to share one of those stories with you that my listeners haven't heard yet. But my podcast, as you said, is finding people around the world whose positive actions are inspiring positive achievements. So it is not a single topic. It's a variety show. And I absolutely love the variety show, as is yours. You have all of these different people on your show, and I do too. And so their stories are all different, and their inspirations are different, but what is in common is that they are completely putting out these positive imprints here for humanity for generations to come and even beyond. And as we know, everything we say and do is going to be part of humanity in some way. And so we want to be sure that it's a positive and inspiring piece that we leave. And people aren't just doing this to leave behind. They're doing it to make a difference right now. So, and I started the podcast when I was in between jobs, literally. So, and a fellow came to the door. He was a solicitor. He doesn't like to be called a solicitor. Now we're friends, but he was a solicitor for a financial group. And he heard my voice and he said, "Oh my gosh, you should be on a podcast. You should have your own podcast show. You have a great voice." And so I started looking into that and thought, well, you know what? That sounds like a pretty good idea. And then I started looking at a topic, and this is what I wanted to do because I want to showcase, and I don't think showcase is the right word, but I want to feature people whose stories aren't being heard and whose inspirations aren't being seen except for within their community. And I want to share those because I think it's important for people to, number one, be able to identify their own positive imprint. And it's hard for people. And my tagline is, "What's your PI?" And it's very hard for people to say and to identify their own and to say, yeah, I am doing good. But there is a lot of good in the world, and I want to identify it and bring it to listeners so that listeners do know that there's fabulous, great people out there. There's activities to get involved in, and so on. Anyway, that's my long answer. So there.
No, that's cool. And you mentioned that it came about while you were between jobs. So Did either of the jobs have any impact on the topic of the show and how you approached that? Like, were you finding inspiring stories beforehand, or was this completely different from what the jobs were?
Completely different. I am a literacy specialist and a teacher, so I was looking to do something, I don't know, something not different, because I didn't know what I wanted in between jobs. But I was with the Department of Education, and they had me traveling, almost 4 hours a day, just one way. So that's 8 hours, and I would have to live somewhere else and be apart from the family, and I didn't want to do that. So I needed to look into something else. And then what happened is my dad left us. He died at Christmas 2017. And it was so sudden. Nobody was expecting it. And right after Christmas dinner, and he just collapsed in the house and he was gone. And so I had been thinking about the podcast, and Dad had been there through the process, and we'd all been trying to think of a name. And so I wanted to, after that incident, I wanted to continue on with my vision of doing this. So, yeah. So it was kind of different events that kind of occurred in this chronological order of the job, and then the solicitor, and then Dad.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned, obviously, it was very sudden with your dad's passing. Like, it was completely out of the blue and unexpected. With him being such a huge part of the conception, if you like, and the idea behind what the direction, was it hard to get back into the saddle when you were ready to launch, the following year? How did that come about? What was that process like?
Oh my, it was hard. So the process was actually, it had to it was in my head, and I was grieving, and I just didn't want to I didn't want to do anything. I was just so distraught over this. And it was actually when I went to do a tribute for my dad's birthday, which is May 2nd, and I'm a dancer. So I chose a piece of music by Chris Knoll, and a beautiful piece. And I did this tribute to Dad. And the music, as I was listening to all the different music pieces that Chris does, I started becoming more inspired to, oh my gosh, I have to do this podcast. So it was after I did that tribute, and after listening to Chris's music over and over and over again, and he's a pianist, and getting that inspiration, then I started diving back into the podcast. And then I started looking for people around the world to help me. And it was actually one of your friends, Mark Asquith, who reached out to me when he saw that I was looking for, hey, I need some help. I have no idea what to do. And then that relationship, and Mark is over in England, that relationship helped me to build what I needed and what I needed to know about the podcast. So
Oh, that's cool. Like Mark's, yeah, he's like a force of nature when it comes to podcasts, and it's crazy how much he wants to help people, and that's your story just enforces that. That's really cool.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And there were other people too, lots of people. But as far as the website and the know-how, Mark was there, so that was helpful. And then James from Mark's group also. I don't know if you knew him. I think it was James Marriott, I think was his last name. So yeah, so there's been some really good people around the world who have helped me get the show moving. And then the listeners have been phenomenal, absolutely wonderful, and beautiful emails that they send. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's one of the most rewarding things of podcasting. Yeah, we can always look for downloads and etc. on your analytics, but it's that knowing that you've connected with someone, and obviously your podcast is about people that are making a positive impact. So, and clearly you're making a positive impact yourself because of the feedback that you're getting and the stories that are being shared with you.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And there is, you're over in Canada, there is a listener in Canada who, she never forgets about my dad. And so I received a beautiful, beautiful condolence card. Even, it had been 2 years, but I had started the podcast, and she knew the story, and she sent such a lovely little email, and and a card, which was really nice. And then she remembered him on his birthday. I just think that that's so special. You just mention these things on the podcast and people just remember. And that's really awfully sweet.
Now, I know your podcast, it shares, as you mentioned, incredibly inspiring stories. And just looking, and they're obviously they're very varied. There's not one single topic or driving theme. Well, there's a driving theme, obviously, the positivity.
Right.
But it shares different topics. I mean, you've spoken to people that have had death threats because they've been fighting for children's rights, families that have had to deal with suicide, survivors of the Chernobyl tragedy, which I found incredible.
Yes.
When I was listening to it, and inspiration. You mentioned yourself. You're a dancer, and one of them was about how someone is inspiring through the act of dancing. So how do you go about finding guests, and is there a process for what kind of stories to share?
Oh, I love that you asked this question, because finding guests is one of the most exciting parts of this. And I actually find them off of the internet. I don't know most of these people. I mean, some of them I do know, yes. But most of them I don't. And so, for instance, I was so inspired by these pictures that Espen Litzo, who was a guest, he's from Norway, and he was putting these beautiful pictures of the outdoors on his Instagram account. But what he wrote about the pictures really caught me, and it was inspiring words, not just, oh, hey, here's a picture of the waterfalls we hiked to, blah, 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 that type thing. It was these waterfalls or not waterfalls, but the fjords or whatever it might be, the lakes he was at. He would say, please get outdoors and enjoy the outdoors. Help with he's a nurse, help with your stress. See what's available just in your front yard and take it all in and reflect. And I was just really inspired and taken in by all that. So I contacted him, and we started a communication and a relationship, and I had him on the show, and he was amazing. And I'm still getting people who love the episode that he was featured on. And then his girlfriend, Kina, was also on. So that's one way. And other ways are listeners send me, oh my gosh, I met this person, or oh my gosh, I just saw this person on Facebook, or I saw them on TV. Please try to have them on the show. And so I will try to do that. And others I might meet at a podcast conference, and they have stories to tell. Or I just Google interesting people of Africa, and all these names come up, and so I'll start researching and then calling. So it's so much fun to meet these people. It is, and I wish that I know the world is small, but I wish it were smaller so we could just see each other instead of on the screen. So that is a remarkable part of what I do, and I love it. I love it so much. And yeah.
That's cool to hear, because I know a lot of people don't like the research part of the podcast and when they've got guests coming up. But I like your stuff. I like to sort of find out more about the person I'm going to be speaking with. But do you ever find that you disappeared down a rabbit hole? It's almost like the YouTube. You watch one video, and 5 hours later you're watching the 100th video related to that person or topic. Do you ever find yourself disappearing down guest rabbit holes, for example?
Oh my gosh, yes, all the time. But that can be fun in itself, because you're grabbing a story and you're grappling with, should I or shouldn't I contact this person? Because sometimes they're bigger than what you are maybe able to tackle, or maybe you think. There was one, Father Ray Kelly. He's in Ireland, and I was in Idaho. This is such a fun story. I was in Idaho, where my sister lives, which is in the United States. Well, for you would know that, but in the United States. And one of our friends sent me a video of Father Ray Kelly singing the Hallelujah song at a wedding. And I thought it was so fabulous. And my sister and I were up till about 2:00 in the morning, as you said, down that rabbit hole, looking up everything about Father Ray Kelly and every video. And we're just, oh my gosh, this guy is incredible. And so the next day we shared the videos with my mother. And my mother said, Catherine, you should contact Father Ray. Yeah, right, Mom. And she said, Catherine, just contact him. And so I contacted him and he said, yes, I'd love to be on the podcast. And I had him on the show. We did a 2-episode because he was also on Britain's Got Talent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And recently he was on Dancing with the Stars out in Ireland. And I had such a good time with him. And now we have this beautiful relationship where we're able to contact each other and say hello and hear about what each other, what we're doing and what our families are doing. So it was exciting. And I was just, just one of those exciting times when Mom says, just do it. And his YouTube had 65 million views.
Oh, wow. Yes. That's a viral sensation right there.
It is.
And it's a beautiful song as well. So to hear, someone of the faith singing that song, it must have been a real connection for him to do that.
Yes, it was wonderful. So there's just amazing, wonderful people. And I can remember, it hasn't even been that long, but I can give you a quote from each and every person because it's not just a job right. I have them on the show and have a recorded conversation. I learn from them and I am inspired from them. And they do have wonderful quotes.
And that ties into my next question perfectly. So thank you for that. It's like a professional intro. So obviously you've got a very varied show with different guests and amazing stories. Has there been, this might be something that you don't answer, but has there been any that have stood out particularly for you, either because of a deep connection with your own experiences or because of the story that was being shared? And if so, why that episode or these episodes in particular?
Oh, each week the episode is like, oh my gosh, this is the best episode ever. And then the next week, oh my gosh, this is the best episode ever. So no, not any one at all, because the stories are so interesting and the people are so interesting. So there's not been any one that's been a favorite at all, or one that's been more inspiring than the next. They all have been equally fabulous, but I think what is different than some of the others is a continued relationship. So continued communication with some of the guests is ongoing, and that is what is much more special for me, is that friendship. And so I can talk to people that I've had on the show several times a week or several times a month, and some, they don't contact me at all anymore, and that's fine. And so I think that is what makes the difference for me, is the continued connection.
And speaking of that, I mean, obviously you mentioned that every episode you could pull out a quote from every single episode that you've done. So what are some of the things that you've taken from guests, and how's that implemented or been implemented in your own life then? Oh,
I think that it makes me a better person every day, because I feel that what I'm bringing to the world, such positivity and also struggles, and it's showing me the human side, because a lot of these people do some of the things that I do or used to do or still am doing, but never feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm really making a difference, because we all feel that way. And I feel that way even, some days, oh, is the podcast making a difference? And so when I have a guest on, sometimes their story hits home a little bit more. And then I realize, yeah, you know what? This is validating the work I did maybe in the 1980s, or it validates work I'm doing today, or validates what I'm thinking about doing tomorrow. So yes, there are some that definitely, what they say will definitely hit a little harder than others. And one of them, Kahika Shah, who I just had on recently, she had death threats. And she's not doing anything that you would consider someone to cause a death threat. She's wanting to save the environment. She's wanting to have social justice. And a death threat is just not something that I would even think about, that any of these people on my shows would have to grapple with, or I was shocked by that. And she's only 20 years old. So that hit me pretty profoundly. And then there's people like Mary Shields, who is the first woman to have entered the Iditarod and completed the Iditarod. She didn't win, but she completed it. And she opened the door for female athletes in all sorts of male dominated sports, such as even track and so on. And this was 1974. So it's just anything that these people say or do is incredible, because you can take to heart and you can take also logically and move forward with things. So that's a really good question.
No, and like you said, I was amazed listening to that episode about the fact that this is a person that's doing good in the world. How could you possibly want to be in a position where you send a death threat? I mean, what does that say to you as the person that you are? And I'm wondering if, certainly within the last few years, that the divisiveness that's being introduced to the world and encouraged by leaders, etc., that's got to have an impact. People have to realize that their words, are going to be taken literally and acted upon, unfortunately.
And that's such a true statement, Danny. That is such a true statement. And leaders set the tone. They do set the tone for what is to come. And certainly the tone changes, but oftentimes it will take years to reset a tone. And that's why these people that are on my show and on your show and on other shows that are doing such good in the world and trying to, and you talked about leadership. Not all of the people that I have on the show consider themselves leaders. They're just out doing what they're doing, and they don't think twice about it. And I think that's what also makes them special and I don't want to say unique, but unique for a better word, but it is what makes them true to their self and true to the work they're doing. And there are some that are doing what they're doing to make money, but in a positive scheme of things, like the bicycle glass men, the gentlemen out in Minnesota. And they have a company where they blow glass, and that can leave a very negative global footprint because of the wear and tear on the earth and the pollution and so on with the shipping and whatnot. But they use recycled glass. So they're trying to cut that footprint and turn it into more of an environmental positive, doing something a little bit better, but we still need glass fixtures for our light bulbs. We can't do without those, or we would just, be blinded. So their story is very interesting, and they are making money on what they're doing, but it's still positive. It is still inspiring, and it's still doing something that is helping to grow other people who want to have the same for our planet.
It's kind of like there's a Canadian company called Spotify. Not Spotify, that's not a Canadian company, Shopify. Good grief. I need my morning coffee, obviously. There's a Canadian company called Shopify. And obviously they're one of the biggest global e-commerce companies. Mm-hmm. But they've just announced that every one of their vendors, Shopify will offset any carbon footprint that they need to ship the products out. So to your point, it's helping people do good and do what they want to do with their lives, from an independence point of view, and making sure the planet's not suffering because of it. So I think it's always, you mentioned unique, I think it's always the ones that do the stuff in the background that are the huge change makers, because they're not out for glory or anything. They're just changing, making change, right?
Right. And that is so true. And I've had some incredible, oh my gosh, I just have had such incredible people. And I'm thinking of some of the Aussies, some of the Australian folks who are oceanographers, who are the forefront folks with climate change and doing the research and providing the research for our legislative governments around the world. And I just think of the hard work they've been doing and the push they've had. And it, when I was talking to Kahikasha, she's 20 years old, and I told her, Kahikasha, I so hope that it doesn't take a lifetime to make change, because it seems like climate change and some of the other environmental laws that we want to have enacted worldwide are taking more than a lifetime. And I don't know. I learned so much, and then I'm saddened by some things, but moving forward with others. And these people, they give their whole life to this research and living on a boat and being away from their families for so long. Just greatness around the world.
And speaking of that, you'd mentioned that your podcast is often validated for the work that you've been doing previously because of the people you spoke to and what's happening now and what you were doing in your previous work. And I know you'd mentioned that there was a trip to Lithuania.
Oh, yes.
Where you really discovered how powerful the women were making a positive, being a positive force for the community with providing education and food, etc. But you also mentioned that your life was changed by a visit to a hospital there.
Oh, yes.
Can you share, the stories about obviously the women, but what was that event that changed it for you?
So when I was out there, I was out visiting schools and working with an organization and visiting the people. This was right after the wall had fallen out there. So it was early on. It was 95, so pretty, and there was still a lot of unsettled people there with, even though the wall had fallen and freedoms were becoming instilled back into them, there was unrest. But we went, just two of us, we went into a local hospital because we wanted to see what the hospital was like, what they were providing, because the women that we were talking to were pretty much the full force of life there, because so many of the men had been removed from their communities to, I don't know, they don't know where they went, but they didn't come back after the wall fell, so I don't know what happened to those men. But we thought, let's go in and see what we can do, what there is available as far as our resources go. We didn't know we had no idea what to expect. And number one, we were told, you shouldn't go into the hospital because it will not be what you expect. So when the two of us walked into the hospital, there was it was a single building, a single story. It wasn't two-story. And there were all these beds, and they just had these little curtains. And when we walked in, there was this lady who was screaming, and she saw the two of us come in, and the woman walked over, and she was carrying a child. She was 2 years old. It was a baby. It was 2 years old. And she handed the baby to me, and there was blood everywhere. And it's not like the baby was dripping blood, but it obviously the baby either was in surgery or had an injury. I don't know. Well, I found out what it was, but I didn't know at that time. And the mother is screaming in her language at me, and the doctor comes running over and took the baby back from me. And he said this, and obviously the baby was dead. The baby had passed, and the woman was upset. And so the doctor explained to me that she was telling me she recognized us to be from the Western world, and she was screaming at us that it is because of the Western world that her baby is dead. And so I asked the doctor, I don't understand, because the wall fell. I don't understand. And he said, it's Bosnia-Herzegovina. And he said, the Western world, and remember, this is in the 90s when the Western world didn't go in to help the people there. And so there was a lot of wartime in that area. This woman came from a family of 5. She had 4 kids and a husband. And the baby, the youngest one, was too young to journey with the husband and the rest of the siblings. So the mother stayed with the young one and was going to try to journey, because they were refugees and they were trying to escape. And so she was going to stay as long as she could and try to figure out how they would get out. But the baby was injured, and the baby was how they got that child from the south over into Lithuania. The doctor was explaining to me, and it didn't make any sense to me, but the lack of resources. So I don't know how long that child, either on a helicopter or how the baby got up there with all of the traveling that was taking place. But the woman was so upset over two things: the death of her baby and the fact that her husband, and remember, we didn't have cell phones back then, she had no way of contacting or finding her husband and the other kids. And she had no idea where they were. And she was just in this horrible place. Not the hospital, but in this horrible place in her life, losing her child and blaming it on the West, and then not being able to contact her family. And that so changed my life. Was, number one, having this baby literally thrown into my arms who had passed, and I wasn't expecting that. And number two, hearing the story from the doctor about this woman and what her life was like. And so when I came back to the United States, I was teaching. I told the students this story, and I said, when you go to the grocery store, simple things like putting the cart in its spot makes a difference for people who work at the store. Don't put that cart in the middle of the parking lot. I mean, that's just such a little simple thing for little children to know. But tell your parents, work with your parents, because this woman has lived through hell. And I never found out, and I never will know, if she ever found her husband again. Ever. And the doctor explained to me that there are Red Cross workers that really work at documenting where these families are going. So he had hope that she will find her family again. And that also gave me inspiration that, oh my gosh, these volunteers who are out there are documenting all this. And then later on, when I did a show with All Hands and Hearts, who is a group that goes out to reunite families lost in hurricanes and tornadoes and so on, and to help build the towns again. That just brings back all those memories of that hospital visit and knowing that woman was dispersed. And the All Hands and Hearts, they do pretty much the same, and they will help you reunite your family. Of course, we have cell phones today and computers and more technology. But that visit, I mean, I cried and I cried for so long. In fact, right after that, I went up and I tried to get a hold of my husband on the phone because I was just so emotional after that visit. And then finding out that that hospital, that country only had 2 ventilators. And here we're talking about ventilators today with COVID. That country had 2 ventilators for the entire country back then. It was just, so it made me come back and do more work with the students that I was working with, and to write more letters to congressmen and to do more in Europe and to keep track of those people that I met in Europe and help them any way I can. So, sorry, that was kind of a long story.
No, well,
yeah.
That's incredible. I can't even begin to imagine what that whole experience would have been like. I mean, I've got 2 young kids, 10 and 8-year-old. So I can only imagine, what that would feel like as a parent, but just as a human being. That's incredible. And I follow the work of Doctors Without Borders a lot. I did a charity thing like 10 years ago or something, and they were one of the recipients. And their work's incredible, and they share, as you mentioned yourself, Catherine, how often we go in to help, but we actually make things worse because we don't have any backup for what's next after, say, we topple a regime or something like that.
Right. That's right. And there are just so many things that that happen in our world, and you are correct, and certain decisions we make, whether it be with people or with nature, putting our hand and getting involved sometimes makes it worse, and we don't know how to make it better. And I look back, Chernobyl. Chernobyl was such a catastrophe. And one of the things that I did when I came back from Lithuania was, okay, I have to do something more. I have to do something more. So I joined an organization called Children of Chernobyl. And that organization was United States based. I think it was actually United States and Canada based, where we were bringing children from Chernobyl over to the States and Canada to have them x-rayed and checked for cancer so that we could help them and do something with the resources that we have available to us. And so we had a student come from Chernobyl that we sponsored, and he was here, Alosha, cute little boy. And of course, he's not a boy today. And he was cancer-free, and he was so happy. His brother was not. His brother was in a wheelchair due to the injuries. He was at school, his brother, and so he had injuries from the radiation and everything, and he caused him to be in a wheelchair and other issues, cancer, and I'm sure he's no longer with us today. But that experience in Lithuania made me realize I have to do more than just what I'm doing. And it doesn't have to be only in my community, because my community is worldwide. We are citizens of the world. And that comes from Michael Pereira, one of the guests I had. He was so clear on sending that message to the listeners that we are no longer citizens of our own community. We are citizens of the world. And now look, we have COVID. Yes, we are citizens of the world. So anyway, Children of Chernobyl. And when I was out in Lithuania, I wanted to go to Belarus to go visit Alexei, but the people who do the visa over there, however it works, they said, if you come here first before you go to Lithuania, then you may, but otherwise we're not going to give you a visa to come to Belarus. And well, my schedule didn't allow for that, and so they said, then you can't come. And so I didn't get a visa to go into Belarus, and I just wanted to go see Alexei, but things were still very unsettled.
Mm. And that part by Michael that mentioned that we are global citizens now. I think you mentioned COVID, and I have to laugh when I see some of the skeptics and the conspiracy theorists saying, well, it's all a fake disease to have the government controls, etc. I mean, how else would we get this vaccine so quickly instead of 10 years? But then you think, well, we've never had really an issue like this where we've had to have the global science community work together to combat this. So of course it's going to be fast, and yes, there's going to be risks and dangers, but just because something's coming together fast doesn't mean it's false. It's just we've never really had the need to get so many scientists from all parts of the world working on one single problem.
And yes and no, because when you look at WHO, so I had someone on the show with WHO, and he's an American and he's living in Switzerland, closer, well, that's where WHO is, but he was working with researchers and gynecologists and midwives all around the world, which is exciting because you're learning not just what the science is, but also what the different cultures are doing. And granted, most of the research was coming from the Western states. So yes, you would be correct that a lot of these countries who haven't been involved in the research before are involved now. So yes, Danny, I get what you're saying, and absolutely true. And it is exciting. And maybe that will bring less, I'm going to say it in a more positive way. Maybe that will bring more of a larger table to come together with our leaders to build a better and a more lasting political relationship with a little bit more in mind with the people involved.
And I know a lot of people are talking about the opportunity for the Great Reset. And I think, as you mentioned, Catherine, this is an opportunity. It's a tragic opportunity.
Yes.
And too many people have died that didn't need to die. But hopefully we can take that and learn from that. And as you mentioned, make sure we learn from it and put it into place to be a more global, network, if you like.
And yes, and this is something you asked me, earlier about what inspires me or what really adds so much to me doing the show. And so I want to bring up Espen. He's from Norway. He's a nurse. When COVID hit and it was at well, of course, we're at our second peak, but when it hit and people didn't know what was going on, I knew he was a nurse at an emergency room, and I reached out to him. And we'd have been talking, because we'd become friends with he and his girlfriend and Bernie, this other fellow in Norway. But I reached out to him because I knew he was at the emergency room. And, it just made him feel so good to know that somebody outside of Norway was looking in and checking in, because it was emotional for our healthcare workers. It was scary for healthcare workers. It still is. And Espen and I had, several conversations. And then I reached out to a couple of other people, one in Africa and one in Australia, and kept up my communication with these folks because they need it. And I think that is one of the gifts that I can provide, or maybe not a gift, but one of the things that I can do to give back is, what, we're here for each other, like you say, and this is an opportunity none of us wanted this, but we have to take it and we have to make good with it instead of being a naysayer and instead of being negative about the whole thing. Just make good out of it, the best that we can.
Your show's now, and it's third year now. I think it launched in 2018. It was summer 2018 it launched? Or?
No, that was when I started the website and started working with Mark. I actually put the trailer out at Christmas in December of 2018, but my launch was actually January 2019 with my first guest. My first guest being Mary Shields, the first woman to enter the Iditarod. And we had so much fun. And then it just went from there. It was, yeah.
So what are your goals with the show now entering I guess it's almost 2 years old now, sorry. So almost 2 years entering your third year. What are your goals for the show, either with the format or the guests, or growing it or scaling or taking it offline to share what you're learning online to the offline community? What's your plans for it?
So what I'm working on right now as we speak, I had to go to every other week with a brand new guest, but keeping to my every Monday I launch. So I launch on Mondays, yourpositiveimprint.com and all of the podcast platforms. But on that alternate week, I'm doing either a re-edited of someone I had on the show, or a conversation, or just a commentary, because I'm doing the logistics for t-shirts, but also I want to do a live show, and I'm working on the logistics on this, where I have guests that I've had around the world, where I'll have 3 of them on, or 4 of them during a series, where the listeners can ask them questions about culture, about maybe COVID. What do you do for COVID out there? About, how you grew up, or the struggles you had that you mentioned on the show. Elaborate on it, etc. So I've already talked to some of the folks that I've had on the show, and yes, they would like to do that. And now it's just working on logistics, which I might just ask you when we're done here, some of the logistics on doing live, because I need it to be where the listeners can see them, not just hear them, but to see them, and where listeners can not just do the chat box, but somehow get them involved, because getting to know each other around the world and each other's cultures, and seeing that, oh my gosh, this person in Nigeria is doing the same type of thing that I've been working on all these years. So that's what I'm working on now, and that's a big undertaking, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of logistics, and of course new pieces of technology that I have to purchase. So I'm so excited about it, though, because the guests that I talked to, the former guests I talked to, that I asked them, they're very excited about it. And it just, I don't know, I get really excited about it because there's just such amazing friends I've met through this podcast around the world. And yeah.
And would this be like a sort of round table, like a live round table with 3 or 4 guests on at the same time, and you sort of bounce back with? And would it be sort of then, would you sort of be looking for people that have a sort of interconnected story because of either their industry, their jobs, the work they're doing, or would it be disparate people with different stories to get a wider?
So no, it would be the different stories, because the listeners are used to the very broad. So I kind of want to keep to that platform. And I have listeners, all over the world. So I want to be sure that I have guests, from different parts of the world each time we do this. And that doesn't mean that the person from Australia, that all the Australian listeners are going to just ask questions of the Australians. They're going to want to know about, the rest of the people in the world. And it's just, I think that it's just something hopeful that I have to bring to the listeners, and to more listeners and new listeners, the coming together of nations, if you will, but really it's the coming together of citizens of the world. And that's how I view it. And I love Michael Pereira for saying that on the podcast, because I use that often.
That's I'm looking forward to that, because that sounds like a really cool live event, it's almost like a mini podfest, kind of, where you'll have the audience, and then up on stage you've got the interviewer and the interviewees. So, I'll be looking out for that coming live for sure.
Yes, I will too. So it's gonna, it's just taking a little bit, a lot of time and a lot of research. So.
Now, as someone that's had this podcast journey, from obviously the ideation, and then the implementation, etc., what would be maybe your advice to a new podcaster, someone that wants to do something similar to yourself, for example, and interview people that they're inspired by, or just really come into the podcasting community?
Oh, my advice hasn't changed. My advice from the beginning has always been, you must be true to yourself and be passionate about what it is you're doing. Do not do something that you think it's going to give you a name or make money. No, you need to stay true to yourself. And that goal, keep that dream. And that's important. There's, there's over 1 million podcasts now. And when you listen to some of the podcasts, at least when I listen to a lot of podcasts, and some of them, you hear the host, and they're not, it doesn't sound like they're being true to themselves. It sounds like they're trying to be what they want the listeners to be. And the listeners don't want that. They want authenticity. And I know I bring that to the show. I know that I do, because the guests are authentic and I'm authentic. And so the advice to start a podcast, and the other advice, technology-wise, don't spend money. You don't need to spend money on these elaborate mics, because the mics actually, the things that I have that, that we see at Podcast Movement, they're not elaborate prices. You can get a really good mic at $99, and so you don't have to spend $500, $600.
No, and I love the fact that you mentioned the authenticity, because I think to your point, the passion, you can tell if someone's not into what they're doing, and they might see it as a quick side gig for, I can get advertisers or sponsors or whatever, and that's the only reason they start a show. And it's like you say, it shows, I love the fact that you mentioned authenticity, both for the guests as well. Now, obviously, you've had a lot of inspiring people A, in your personal life, and B, on your show, and you've gotten to know them. Who would you say is your all-time hero or heroes, and why?
Oh, my husband. And so this would be off the podcast guest list, of course, because the most inspiring for me have been my husband and my parents and my family, really, because they're the ones that are your ultimate supporters and the ultimate loves of your life. So no matter what happens, my husband is there every step of the way, holding my hand, loving me, and my parents, and then of course the siblings. So yeah, I guess in a sense that's a family cliche, if you want to call it that, because everyone says that, but everyone says that because it's the truth. If you don't have that support there of your family unit, then it's really I feel badly for people who don't have the support of their family unit, and it's sad that they don't. So truly mine is there, and definitely my dog, my little Maka dog. But I think as far as the guests go, I would have to say that the ones that are the most inspiring and most supportive for me are the ones that continue to keep in touch with me. And that makes a true difference for me, because it wasn't just I had you on the show and now they're off in the sunset doing their thing. I actually hear from, and it's not like I need to hear from them every day, but I hear from them every once in a while, and that makes a difference for me.
And you mentioned, obviously, your father unfortunately passed, before the show was launched, but was a big driving, force with the ideas and the direction. What do you think your dad would have made of it had he got to listen to the show?
My dad would have been on the phone every day telling me, I listened to it, I loved it. And he would have been telling me, this person, do you remember when we did this in the wilderness and I mentioned this to you? Well, this is exactly what I was teaching you. And so Dad was a philosopher, and he taught me about life using the constellations. And so I learned, and north, south, east, and west. He was a navigator in the Air Force. And so I learned about life literally from stories that he told. And he used a lot of visuals, because I'm a visual learner. My mom is very logical, and it's more difficult for me to learn from or to understand the logic when you're growing up. But Dad taught me through stories. So these stories that people tell are very visual, and I learn from them. And that reminds me of my dad every day. So I know Dad is thrilled, and he's listening to the stories now. And what I do wish is that I would have been able to have him on the show, because he's one of the best teachers I've ever had in my entire life, because he did understand how I need to learn about life. And that was through visual and also through writing. My dad and I share poetry and stories together, and we wrote poetry together through the years. And I so miss that and enjoy that. So that's something that I have done on the show, was I have shared some of that poetry. And Dad would, and I've written poems for Dad, and Dad would be very touched, but he would be, and he is so proud that I have taken everything that he taught me and have turned it into a worldwide lesson for everybody, because Dad is like that too. He wasn't just there for us. He was there for the community. And he was not just one that made out a check and sent it to people. He said, kids, we're going to go to wherever these places were to help these children, to help these elderly, to help the unfortunate, to help build wheelchair ramps at their house, because now they're in a wheelchair and they have no ramp, but they can't afford to put in themselves. So we saw Dad do all of that. And that, of course, made me the person I am today. And because of that, I want to continue Dad's work. And that's truly what I am doing, is continuing his work.
That's incredible. I can tell when I listen to the shows, like I said, the episodes I listen to, I can tell that connection you have with your guests, but also because of your personal, background and what's, gone on in your own life, that you're genuinely doing this because of what you just shared now. It's cool. Cool, such a cliched word. I apologize for using that.
Yeah.
It's cool to find out where that came from and how much an impact, obviously, your family is on the show and your life, obviously.
Yes, and I value that tremendously, and miss it tremendously. Yeah, I'm sitting here staring at a picture of my dad right there. He sits here with me every day.
You've been a co-host on the show almost.
Yes, absolutely, and my mom. Wow, does she ever support the show? And of course, my whole family and my friends. But yeah. But to answer your question, that was a long answer to.
No. Speaking of the show, I mean, I've had an absolute blast today, and again, that's a totally undescriptive word for our conversation that we've just had. And I've really enjoyed, learning more about yourself and your guests and how their stories have impacted your life. For people that want to check out your show and catch up on the episodes that have already been, published, where's the best place to A, find your podcast, and B, connect with you online?
Well, they can connect with me online at yourpositiveimprint.com. And you can, from there, you can sign up for email updates, which are actually, they're the newsletters. You learn more about the guests, some things that I don't have on the podcast. So there's some interesting little pieces about guests. And so they can sign up on my website. And then, of course, any podcast platform, or most anyway, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, Spotify, recently Amazon Music, and any of them, Stitcher, all of them. So it's just been an honor, truly, to have these guests on my show to share with the world and all of the listeners who are enjoying the guests. So I really thank the listeners for sending me the emails and enjoying the people that I have on the show. And again, Your Positive Imprint. What's your PI?
And I'll be sure to drop all the links to your website, the show, and how to connect with you online in the show notes. So if you're listening on your favourite podcast app, make sure to check the show notes as usual and, go over and check Catherine out.
Yeah, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram. And so you can see pictures of the guests, not just from the website, but on Facebook and Instagram, Your Positive Imprint. And I do a little bit with Twitter, What's Your PI? But, there's not a lot of pictures there. People want to see pictures. They want to see what the people look like.
And I'll make sure to link out to that, especially on Instagram. I didn't get into Instagram early on, but now I'm really enjoying it. So I'll make sure to link over to that.
Yeah. And are you doing a YouTube? Do you do YouTube? I just started doing YouTube.
I'm not at the moment. I may, like we're using Squadcast at the moment for our conversation, for example, and they're releasing a video recording suite later next month, I believe, in December. So we'll see what that's like. I may do maybe an offshoot of the podcast with reduced timing or something, but we'll see. I know a lot of podcasters are obviously doing YouTube, so we'll see.
Yeah. So I have the YouTube channel, Your Positive Imprint, but I do love my tagline.
No, and it speaks to the show. It's easy to remember, and it definitely speaks to the show. So I think if anybody needs to find it, typing in Your Positive Imprint on a podcast app should pop straight up.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Danny, thank you. Thank you. You've been a delight.
Thanks for appearing. And I've really enjoyed our chat today. And I'm looking forward to catching up on even more episodes. I know you've got a nice back catalogue for me to just plug my headphones in when I'm sort of, sitting or going on the treadmill or whatever, or going for a walk, getting outside, going back to Michael's point, getting outside. Or not Michael, you're, who's the person over in Norway that mentioned to get outside?
Oh, Espen.
Espen, that's right.
Espen.
Yeah, so get outside. We moved to a beautiful little village in the north of Ontario, and it's surrounded by lakes and trees and everything. So we'll be doing a lot of trailing and stuff.
Good for you. And the podcast is, my guests are infinite. So, because there's an infinite world out there of people doing positive things.
Okay, so thank you, Catherine, for appearing on the show today. I'm really looking forward to our listeners, finding out more about you, because I know there'll be a lot to take away from your story and the stories of your guests.
Well, Danny, thank you so much. I really enjoyed sharing your positive imprint.
Okay, so this has been another episode of Podcaster Stories. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, be sure to share it with anybody you feel may, take value and enjoy it as well. And you can find it on your favourite podcast apps like Google Podcasts, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or just head on over to podcasterstories.com and sign up for the newsletter for some more exclusive content. Until the next time, take care and stay safe.